It's a great pleasure to be with you. I want to special thanks to Joe Michael, Shelley, the entire team here for making this happen and for inviting me to be part of this really important discussion about family businesses. And this is a topic that I spend my life both advising families. I teach at a business school, do some writing, and so this is my life. And I'm a big believer in how important family businesses are to society. So I'm delighted to be spending this afternoon talking about these topics with all of you. As Joe mentioned, my colleague and I wrote a book that came out last year, and I wanted just to draw attention to the bottom part, which is, the tagline of the book, which is to how to build and sustain a successful, enduring enterprise. And you might ask, why? Why should we focus on longevity? Why does it matter if family businesses are around for the long time? Or any business around for the long term. One reason that longevity is actually a key way to build the strongest companies in our country. There's a statement or quote from Andrew Carnegie that put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. And if you look around we tend to think of family businesses, many of them are small corner stores and things like that, but some of them are extraordinarily large. And unlike some of the tech companies that are, farther up the coast here in California, they didn't get there all at once. If you look at the 10 largest family companies, which are all tens of billions of dollars in revenue, they got there over about 100 years on average. So it takes time to build a company that is sizable. It's not usually the work of any one generation. And so to build these really pillars of the economy, we need to think about how to have these businesses last for the long term. And that's really why the reason why I really believe in this work is family businesses matter. There's a lot of research that points to, on average, we have the Sacklers and some that are not done such a great job, also family businesses. But on average, family businesses tend to be better employers, better corporate citizens. As we were going through the pandemic, I was talking to one family business leader, and their industry was very disrupted by all of it, and they compete against public companies and so on. And he said, my competitors were basically bragging about how many people they fired, like how much they reduced headcount, to show to Wall Street how committed they were to making their quarterly earnings targets. And they basically, he said, we had to fire some people. We did everything we could possibly do to avoid that, because we really care about our people. And I get the great privilege to work with family businesses around the country, around the world, and they really are these pillars of their communities. The other reason I think it's important to talk about longevity is there's this idea that family businesses are fragile. How many of you have heard some version of the 3-generation rule, that the first generation makes the business, second generation rests on their laurels, and by the third generation, the business is gone and the family's poor again? I hate this idea. Let me just put that out there. I think at best, it's very misleading. All it's really telling you is that making any business last for 3 generations, which is about 100 years or longer, is really hard. Okay, it is hard. You know that. Business longevity is challenging. What it doesn't tell you is that somehow family businesses are more fragile than other kinds of companies. And in fact, if you look around the world at the longest lasting companies, the vast majority of them are actually family businesses. And then wealth, this whole idea that if we have a business, it's going to go away very quickly. Also, that turns out not to be true. This is the kind of analysis you can only do in a place like Italy. There are some economists there, and they looked at who was paying the highest taxes, so the wealthiest people in the country back in the 14th century. They looked again at the beginning of the 21st century, and almost everyone who was at the top today was already at the top way back then. So wealth just doesn't dissipate. We hear the stories and the examples, and we like to tell those stories about family businesses. But the reality is that it's much more enduring than we like to give it credit for. And the reason why I have a problem, the reason I use the word hate, is because I think it actually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. At least every semester when I teach one of my classes, I'll have someone. We go around the room at the beginning of class. People will sort of say, my name is this person, I'm from, this part of the world, and I'm from this generation, I'm the third generation in my family business, I'm the one who's going to ruin it. I'm like, no, that's not exactly how this works. So it actually becomes this belief system that people think I have to choose between my business surviving and my family owning it, when in reality, if you do it the right way and sort of take the steps that you need to, family ownership makes it much more likely the business will survive than any other kind of ownership. And lastly, I think actually we were telling the wrong story about family businesses, because the things that family businesses do well are becoming more and more important in the competition that all companies are facing. When we talk about values-based businesses, everyone wants to work on one. We talk about our corporate values and so on. Well, our values come from our families, not from companies. And family businesses are able to imbue the company generation after generation with these values that really matter. You're able to have a greater connection to the community. All the things that we're talking about this sort of better version of capitalism, are all things that family businesses are actually quite good at. So, if that's the reason why longevity is so important, how do you get from here to there? Well, there's a few things I think. There's not a magic formula, otherwise I promise I'd give it to you. But there are some things that help to make family businesses last for the long term, and they helpfully all start with C. The first is context, and it's important to remember that there is no one way to be successful, right? And there are very few things that I would consider to be best practices in the sense that they're right for every family business and every generation. For every idea that someone has to say, this is how we do things in our family. Everyone goes and works for 10 years outside the company and then they come in. I can go find you someone who's been equally successful and done the exact opposite. There is no one right way to do it. And in fact, one of the greatest threats to family businesses is that the things that worked really well for one generation can actually cause the downfall of the next. Just because it worked well among a group of 3 siblings working together doesn't mean it's going to work well for a group of 7 cousins who are in a very different situation. So it's really important to pay attention to the context and to understand that every situation is different. So if there's not one right answer, what is it about? Well, it's about choices. And what really makes family businesses different and unique is the fact that they are owned by a family. And ownership is something that we really don't talk that much about in the business world because we tend to think about it like owning shares in Apple. You as an owner, you try to buy low and sell high. You don't get to do very much. In a family business where the ownership is concentrated in a few people, you can do a lot. Think about owning your home or owning a car. That means that you have the right to do things that no one else can do unless you give them permission. And how you exercise those rights, what you do with that power that comes with ownership, is what determines the long-term success or failure of the business. And so what you're looking for is not the right or wrong answer. You're trying to say, do we have something that works for us? And will the same thing work for the next generation? And then lastly, there's a culture. There's a certain set of traits that we've found to be quite common in families that make it over the long term. One of them is that they're curious. They ask a lot of questions. So give yourself all a check mark for that one coming here. They don't think they know all the answers. The second is they realize that this is a team sport, not an individual sport. And so being willing to actually do the work, to do not just the work of the business, but to do this family business work that we'll talk about today, is really essential to success. And lastly, they're adaptable. If you want to be around for 50 years or 100 years or 200 years, the business is not going to be the same. The family is not going to be the same. How are you able to adapt as you go across generations? Okay, so one of those pieces of the puzzle, this is as Joe said, this is chapter 4 in the book, is about the decision-making power that you have as the owners of a company. And the owners of a business can literally make every single decision if you want to. Everything from the strategy of the business to the color scheme on the walls and everything in between. That's the power that comes with owning a company. But as the business gets larger, the family gets larger, it's hard to do that everything directly. And so you have to think about, how do I make decisions? How do I think about what to delegate versus what to keep? And that's the work of governance. And so the work of governance in a family business is to do a few things. It's not to make things bureaucratic. One of the things that makes family businesses better is the ability to make decisions quickly. You can pivot because you don't have to go answer to 12 layers up and some corporate board that's just trying to cover their downside risk. You actually can make big decisions very fast. And so governance is about trying to figure out how to keep that edge as your business and family get more complicated. It's also about trying to find some middle ground between being sort of an absentee owner of the business and meddling too much. And this is something that can be challenging to do. As the owner of a business, you're tempted to solve every problem, but you can't possibly. And it's really hard for the business to grow if you're doing that. So finding that middle ground is really essential. Governance is a lot about also helping you to manage conflict. I actually teach this class called Managing Conflict in Family Business. And one of the topics we talk about is that conflict is a Goldilocks problem, meaning that too little conflict actually has the same negative effects as too much conflict. And so what you're trying to do is not to avoid all the issues and pretend that there are no disagreements. You're trying to find some space in the middle. And governance, creating rules and processes and things like that, is a really helpful way to do that. So it's not about becoming bureaucratic. It's about helping you to have a business and a family that can scale over time. Now, in the beginning, in the early stages of a family business, even before it's a family business, when it's a founder-led business, governance is actually really simple. So here we have our founder, CEO, indispensable, right? That kind of person there. Some of you may be that person. And decision-making is actually pretty simple. It's at the end of the day, it's the same rule that I use with my kids when we might disagree, which is, why are we doing this or why are we not doing that? Well, because I said so, right? That's the ultimate decision rule, and that works just fine at that early stage. But as more people come in, as it truly becomes a family business with multiple generations and multiple folks, that's when things start to get complicated. And we really develop this idea of the 4 rooms as a way to deal with and manage that complexity. So the insight of the 4 rooms is just like in your own home, you do different work, you make different decisions in the kitchen where you're thinking about dinner and what are we going to have tonight, versus in the living room where you're thinking about what show are we going to binge on Netflix, right? In your family business, you do different kinds of work, you make different kinds of decisions. And the 4 rooms are each of those 4 different types. And so it's a way of understanding what those different roles are and how they relate to each other. So starting here at the bottom here, we have the management room. This is where you're running the business on a day-to-day basis. You're making, dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of decisions about, pricing, about hiring people, all those kinds of, products, all that kind of stuff. Then we have the boardroom, and the boardroom is not where you're running the business on a day-to-day basis. It's where you're thinking about, well, who should be the leadership of the company? Or, where are we going over the next 3 to 5 years? Or maybe we have some big decision to make. Maybe it's, buying, investing in a new asset or buying a company or some big decision, going to a new geography where we want to actually take a step back from the day-to-day operations, and really be more thoughtful about that decision. Then we have the owner room, and the role of the owners in this structure is to make a relatively small number of really important decisions. Like, do we keep the company private or do we go public? When we're profitable at the end of the year, do we pay that money out in dividends or do we reinvest it back in the company? Are there certain things we won't do, even if they might make us money because they're against our values? And if we do have a board, an actual formal board of directors or advisors, who should be on that? Who should represent our interests? So this is intended to be a hierarchy. Management ultimately, is responsible to the board. The board ultimately is selected by and answers to the owners. Then we have the family room. And the family room is not about making business decisions. It's about thinking about how do we connect the family to each other? How do we develop talent? How do we prepare people to step into these different rooms, create bridges into them? And maybe there's some family activities or family assets that aren't business related, but that we own as a family. Maybe it's a foundation or a philanthropic program or a vacation home or a sailboat. There are things that are not business assets that we have to make some decisions about as a family. And so the work of governance, thinking about these 4 rooms, is to answer these questions about them. The first question is about structure. do we have the spaces we need to be able to do the work of that room, to be able to make those decisions? The second one is about process. Do we have good ways of making important decisions that are happening either within one of those rooms, or even more importantly, when we have important decisions that cut across those different rooms? And lastly, it's about talent. Do we have the people, whether it's family members or non-family members, to do the work that each of those rooms requires? So I'll just give you a little bit of a click down on each of these three dimensions, and then we'll turn it over and you'll kind of talk about how you're all doing on governance. So starting with structure, and as I said, the goal here is not to become bureaucratic and create all kinds of different meetings and things that you don't necessarily need. It's to make sure that you have enough structure to be effective. And so even if you're talking about like a simple, family business where you don't need a ton of structure, even using this discipline can be very helpful. So this is actually not the picture of the family that I'm going to tell you about, but think about this is a family that we worked with, and there were 5 siblings that had taken over this business from their parents, and they met together and had lunch every day. And the lunch conversation would go all over the place, everything from deeply operational decisions to what we think of as strategic decisions to what dividends should we pay out from our profits, or where are we going on family vacations. And the conversation just tended to go round and round and round because they never really resolved any of those things. And so we got them into a mode of just thinking to say, okay, let's really divide up these conversations into having different conversations about management meetings, right? We're going to actually talk about the operations of the business. Sometimes, once a quarter, it could still be over lunch if you want, but have a board conversation and think about what's our strategy? Where are we going as a company? How's that going? Having the owner discussion, maybe twice a year, thinking about that dividend conversation, or about other sort of big moves. And then the family, where are we going? Where's our family vacation going to be? Setting up separate time to do that. And just for each of those, by the way, when you're talking about the family vacation, you should probably invite the spouses because they're family members too, or those that aren't working in the business. And when you're having a management meeting, you should probably invite your senior non-family managers because they were never invited to lunch. And so really just having, clear agendas, being clear about who should be at the meeting, and then just thinking about the hat. Right now we're in having an owner room discussion versus a management room discussion can really help. Just doing that can really help to put some good structure onto a family business. Now, as things get more complicated, so does governance. And so I'll just give you, this is a example of an actual family business governance structure where they've actually built out the different pieces of the 4 rooms. They have their executive team, in the management room. They have a board of directors. This is a family in the 3rd generation with, I think, 20 members of that group. And so they have what we call an owner council that meets on a quarterly basis to talk about some of these owner room issues. They have their annual shareholder meeting. And then the family side, they have a family council that's focusing on developing the next generation, about planning an annual family reunion. And they have these annual family meetings and shareholder meetings. And so as you get further along, that structure becomes really valuable and important to the process. But you don't have to jump there, right? I mean, just by having this discussion about, where are we in these 4 rooms and how do we make good decisions can be a really great place to start. Okay, so that's about structure. Now I'll talk a little bit about process. In a family business, how you do things is usually much more important than what you do. The same decision made through a process that people feel is fair and equitable is much more likely to be successful than exactly the same decision made in a way that people don't understand or feel connected to. So a lot of the work of family businesses is taking those big, important decisions and being thoughtful about how you make them. And so one exercise that can sometimes be quite valuable, especially as you get more into this larger, more complicated structure, is actually being clear about who makes decisions. And so this is a tool that we call a decision authority matrix. It looks complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. You sort of think about who are all the decision-making groups. In this case, we have across the top, we have our owner council, we have our board, we have our management team, we have our family council. And then what are the key decisions, especially those that cut across those? And how do we make sure that people are clear about what their role is? And we happen to use a tool that was developed by Bain & Company, a strategy consulting firm, that just allocates the different roles in decision. Like, the I stands for input. You have a say in that decision, but you don't get to make it. Someone takes all the input and makes a recommendation. Then someone makes the actual decision, and then someone may have to approve that. They might have a veto right. And so just being thoughtful about what are those key decisions, and then sort of spelling out what are the different roles that groups have in making them. Okay? And then not for all decisions, or maybe not for most, but sometimes there's really important decisions that you make as a family business, and actually spelling out the process of how that works. I won't walk through this in detail, but this is a decision map that we worked with one family to create. It's about the question of how do we select board directors for our company. And they always felt like the people were just, the board would do the process, the nominating committee, and they would get submitted names, and at the annual shareholder meeting, they just have to rubber stamp them. And so we don't really want to do that. We want to have a say into how these decisions are made. And so walking through what are the steps, what are the pieces of making that decision, and then what are the different roles that we want to play as a group in doing that. And so as I said, it's a time-intensive process, so you don't want to do it all the time, but especially if there are some decisions that have been contentious or that you are worried might be contentious, taking the time to actually spell out how does that decision work and where do people get involved in it. Okay? Let's get that. So those are good process questions. The other topic I wanted to mention is about talent. And, there's one of the things that's really important as a family business to think about is what we call a family employment policy, which is what are the rules for someone to come into the company as a family member, and what happens once they're in the company. Does anyone here have a family employment policy in their company, whether it's a stated one or just sort of like an unwritten rule? It's a really valuable exercise to go to, and in the book that you'll have gotten, I won't go through this all in detail, but there's almost a step-by-step way of approaching this and thinking about what are the different dimensions of coming into a family business, and then what do we want to do? Do we want actually people to come and work there, or do we want to discourage that? When it comes to compensation, do they get paid like everyone else, or are there certain different rules for family members who are in the business? So actually being thoughtful about how you deal with this issue. A lot of the conflicts in family businesses are about who gets what job and who gets what money. So having a policy to deal with that can be quite helpful. Another thing that can be very helpful is having independent board members. And we have at least one of them in the room for the bank. But there's actually one of the things that we found is that as you get to a certain size, having a board of directors, or it could be advisors, but having people who are not connected to you, not part of the family, can be really valuable. It helps to change the dynamic of the boardroom, makes it a little more professional. People having a little less of the emotional reaction, and they're able to have a little more focused discussion. They can be really helpful in dealing with some of the complicated issues around family members working in the business, and then just having some outside expertise and bringing that to the board can be incredibly powerful. So as I said, I don't really believe there are many things that are best practices, but this is pretty much as close to one as I think you'll find. That if you do it the right way, having a board with independent members brings such value to a family business that I would really encourage you to consider it if you don't have one. And there's lots of ways to do that. It can be an advisory board or a fiduciary board. It can be mostly family or mostly independent. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it, but having that process can be really valuable. Okay, last thing I'll talk about before we open it up for discussion is just some advice on building out governance as you're going through this process. One is that, I showed you a couple examples. That doesn't mean that I think they're right or that you should copy them and just do whatever that family did. Each family is unique. You're kind of each at your own stage of development. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. In some ways, I wish there were, because then I would just tell you and we'd be done. But you actually have to kind of roll up your sleeves and figure out what's the right way to make this work. When you're doing work in governance, you want to make sure that you're actually building on top of the current power structure rather than going around it. By that I mean, sometimes family members will say, well, let's put a board into place. Then all of a sudden, my father, mother, who's making all the decisions, will have to answer to that board. And then, that will sort of stop that process. It's not going to work out, right? If that person doesn't want to, go along with what the board is saying, it's not going to have any real impact. They can just fire the board at any moment in time. So you have to actually work with the folks who are in those decision-making spots to make sure this works for them. On the flip side, it's really important that the next generation is part of this conversation because it has to work for them too. As I said, you want to be careful about just doing governance for the sake of it, having lots of rules and structures and all this kind of stuff, lots of meetings. I mean, no one likes meetings unless there's some purpose or function they have behind them. And so whenever you're doing something new, whether it's a new policy or a new agreement or a new meeting, be really clear about why. Like, what are we trying to accomplish by doing this? What are the goals? What is this going to help us accomplish? And so you really want to get to this level of just enough governance, not having too much and not having too little. And then lastly, it's good to plan ahead. Thinking about that topic of family employment, the best time to do your family employment policy is when all the members of the next generation are like kids or not even born yet. Because then it's not personal. It's not about, well, this person's more qualified than that person and so on. The best time to build these rules is before you need them, right? It's like the adage, you build a house when it is not raining. When it's raining, then you gotta hustle. You gotta cut corners. You have to do what you have to do. But when you have the chance to really think ahead and sort of think about what are the challenges that we are likely to face as a family business over the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, how do we get out ahead of those things so that while everyone's getting along and the business is going well, we can put those things into place rather than having to hustle after some of those crises have already started. All right, so I said that was the last thing that I would, at least for this first part, share with you. Hopefully you've gotten an introduction to the role of governance, the idea of the forums, and then how do you put in place certain structures. You use decision processes. You think about the talent that you need inside the family business to be successful.